Welcome back to the Hazmat Chat podcast. I'm Wendy Buckley, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. We're going to be discussing pre-planning for disasters, what to do when it all blows up. Basically, you can look at this episode like a public relations guide for handling hazardous materials incidents. Obviously, the mantra that we all have is hope for the best, but it should also include prepare for the worst. So obviously, we hope we never have to use this, but we want to make sure that our marketing teams, our public relations teams, and our executives are all prepared for what happens if things do go horribly wrong. So today we're going to be talking about whether you're a warehouse, a manufacturer, a carrier, or any other part of the supply chain. Everyone should know how to respond to the media or to the regulators, the general public, about anytime their stuff has been involved in an incident. Even if that has nothing to do with you, if it had no fault of yours, it was no shortcoming of yours, you're still going to be expected to respond. So the first stage we're going to talk about is what to do before the incident occurs. First thing is you've got to make sure you have trusted supply chain partners. The most important thing is, if you're using trucking companies, for example, you want to vet those carriers and make sure that they have a good performance record, they have a good safety record. And they have a good regulatory compliance record. If they're going to be transporting hazardous materials on your behalf, there's liability that goes along with that. And making sure that you have someone that you can trust and that you know is going to perform as expected and not put any undue risk on your company, you've got to make sure that you know who you're dealing with. So that's the first stage. Any customers that are going to be returning reusable packages to you in good condition should be returning them in good condition, also compliant with the regulations. So if you have rail cars, if you have trucks, if you have totes or what we call IBCs that can be reused, make sure that the customers that you're dealing with or vendors are going to be following the rules. They're doing things safely and making sure that they're inspecting the valves and fittings and the gaskets and whatever else you're supposed to be doing by regulation. Vendors that are following regulatory requirements should also be following your instructions for not only formulations, but also product quality, blend, that sort of thing. So making sure your supply chain is tight all across the board is the very first step in making sure that you're going to be in the best position should you be involved in an incident. One other part about transportation in particular, I highly recommend that you do not put your logo on your private company vehicles. This is a recommendation we always make to our clients. We had one client who decided not to follow this advice, and their material was involved in a railroad derailment in this case. And the 5 o'clock news photographs, all they showed was these blown up photographs of their logo on its side, on a rail car with fire everywhere and material coming out. That is not the image that you want people to have of your company. So while there may be some benefits in advertising and so forth, my opinion is that the drawbacks, the detriments from having your logo on the vehicles that you're transporting your hazardous materials in, the cost benefit is not there. I just recommend you don't do it. Obviously, you always want to make sure your staff is well trained and experienced enough to protect the company and to prevent incidents as much as possible. Not only the people that are actually touching the stuff, your loaders, your forklift drivers, your carriers, whatever the case might be, but also the people that are going to be deciding on policies and procedures, whether that's your EH&S staff. In some cases, it may have something to do with your legal staff, operations team. All across the board, you want to make sure that your staff is well trained and that the right people are in the right places in your company. I think it's John Covey who says, having the right people on the bus in the right seats, okay? There's a kind of an old wives' tale that everyone has heard that ends with an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is never more true in hazardous materials. So make sure that you're preparing ahead of time and having all of your ducks in a row. One of the things that we hear a lot from our clients is that they don't know what they don't know. And that's one of the reasons they seek us out. If you don't know what you don't know, definitely get some help. Seek out a third-party provider that can help you provide that expertise that you lack and either contract them to manage those tasks for you or have them help train your staff to fill in those gaps, whether that's a regulatory compliance gap or an operations gap, a safety gap, whatever the case might be, make sure you know what that stuff is ahead of time. One of the ways you can do that is through audits. If you're regularly conducting audits of your company, you can find any errors or omissions or opportunities for improvement before they become catastrophic failures. Also, I want to caution you to make sure that you train everyone on your team. You know, everyone thinks about the drivers and everyone thinks about the loaders and everyone thinks about, the operation staff, the EHS teams, but they don't think too much about their maintenance crews. There was an incident recently in Georgia, which I talked about on a previous episode, where they were a chicken plant. They processed chickens for consumption. And in order to process these chickens, one of the things that they did was they had nitrogen on the property to fast freeze these pieces of chicken. There was a leak in the freezer, and the maintenance crews went in to address the leak, not understanding or having been trained on the risks of nitrogen. And that's what was in the freezer, was the nitrogen. So the first crew member walks in, gets exposed to the nitrogen, he collapses. The second crew member, same thing. The third crew member, same thing. They ended up losing 2 separate crews of 3 maintenance men each, 6 people total, from a lack of training. They had no idea that there was a hazard or even what to do in that hazard or in the event of exposure to that hazard. They weren't trained on breathing equipment or atmosphere measuring devices. So please make sure that you consider anyone that might come into contact with the material, not just your specialized staff. Regular audits will help you uncover small problems before they become big ones and help you find opportunities to right the ship before it capsizes. So keeping up with that on a regular basis and making sure that you know what the issues are is extremely important. Most importantly, you have to make sure that you're actually doing something about those things that you uncover. An audit finding is not valuable if it's not corrected in a timely fashion. We had one client that we performed audits at their facilities every year in a rotating basis. And every year we would uncover sometimes even safety sensitive audit findings. And then we would check on those things the next time. Hey, what did you do about these items we found the last time? And unfortunately, it was almost invariable that they did absolutely nothing about them. They tabled them, said we'll get back to them later, and they moved on to the next fire that they had to fight. There's no value in performing an audit or uncovering the problems if you're not going to do anything about them. It's a waste of money. It's a really big missed opportunity to correct something before it becomes a problem. We talked about this in a previous episode, but we always want to start with solid, specific, and straightforward written procedures. Make sure those procedures not only cover the minimum regulatory standards, the bare minimum that you're supposed to do, but include an extra measure of safety, because that way, if there is any variation, you're not automatically in a state of non-compliance. You want to make sure that there's room for flexibility. We also want to make sure that you're in line with industry best standards. So for example, if you are going to be performing a function and the rest of the industry does it one way and you're doing it a different way, there should be a pretty good justification for doing it that way, because unfortunately, if it ever becomes a lawsuit, that's going to become a point of contention. Just something to keep in mind. Using simple, clear language so that there's no ambiguity about what needs to be done is also really, really important. It may not be the person that wrote the procedure that's doing the training to be able to explain what they meant by that. It may be this person provides training for the next person, and then that person trains the following person. And what can happen is it gets lost in translation if it's not in clear, definable, unambiguous language. If you use checklists, make sure that they are clear and require positive responses. We talked about that in a previous episode, so we're not going to get into that too much here. But if you're going to use a checklist, make sure they're valuable and that they're actually providing the accountability that you're looking for by doing that. Okay, so those are some of the steps that you can take to prepare for the eventuality of an incident involving hazardous materials. If it actually happens, and let's hope it never does, but if it actually happens, some of the things that you should understand is, first thing to know, in the court of public opinion, most times a no comment is automatically assumed that you're guilty of whatever you're being accused of or whatever you're being questioned about. So never lie, never ever lie, because if it's uncovered, it's going to be really bad. Be truthful, even if the truth is, I don't know, but I'll find out. I don't know is a much better response than a lie. or a guess. A guess is almost as bad as a lie and will be interpreted as such if it ever comes out that you were mistaken. Take control of the messaging immediately. There should be one designated spokesperson, and that person should be the only one that is interacting with the media. Company executives should not be that person. CEOs, COOs, presidents, they have very, very important things to do and deal with during an incident, but communicating with media is not one of them. Anything that the executive wants to contribute to the media should go through the same press contact, the same spokesperson that was designated to speak about the incident. The last thing you want to have is the spokesperson have to clean up and say, oh, what our executive meant to say was, that's not where you want to be, okay? The spokesperson that you choose should be trained and experienced with media relations. You can't unring the bell once mistakes have been made and misstatements have been spoken. So you have to get it right the first time. That spokesperson should understand the company business, the materials that are being produced or manufactured, what you're transporting, storing, and handling, carriers, customers, and vendors that you're working with, the major routes they typically travel, and the logistics of your supply chain. It has happened more than once that the first indication a company has that their material has been involved in an incident is when the media calls and says, hey, what's going on with that crash you had? Or what's going on with this derailment? Or what's going on with this leaking package you've got going on? Or there's a fire happening. What's the story? And you're like, what fire? What incident? What leak? So having a general knowledge of where you're doing business, who you're doing business with, what carriers you're using will at least give you a starting point so that you're not a deer in the headlights when you get that phone call. Have a plan in place ahead of time. Know the steps that you're going to take in the event of an incident and have that plan ready to go. Know how you're going to initiate the plan, what the triggers are going to be, and all the steps that are going to be required. Who is responsible to put that plan into action if and when it's needed? The company should immediately involve themselves in any incident mitigation efforts right from the beginning, any disaster relief. This is not the time to say it's not our fault. Doesn't matter. The perception is going to be it's your stuff and either you stepped in and helped or you turned your back and didn't. So you can deal with blame and liability another time, but right now, making sure that the people that are affected by the incident get the help they need. Be involved in remediation, demonstrate that regardless of whether you're at fault, you want to help make it right. Make all relevant and qualified personnel available to answer questions from the incident commanders on the scene. The firefighting crews have a really hard job, and they can't possibly know about every hazardous material that's out there. The companies that make them have the responsibility to know, and by providing access to either your engineers or your environmental staff or your research and development staff, whatever is necessary, by having those people available to answer questions from the incident commanders can then have the tools they need to make the right choices, whether that's in fire suppression or medical aid, evacuation, whatever. If you have a large incident or what we call a mass casualty incident, I recommend that you set up what we call a war room, basically a room where all of the key personnel, all the key stakeholders are going to be in one place so that there's no miscommunications, there's no overlapping information. Everyone's got the same stuff in front of them. It helps coordinate response and ensure consistent messaging is being disseminated to all sources. As the company, you want to make sure that you help arrange for medical, shelter, food, and comfort provisions for those affected, whether that's the people that were actually exposed to the product, involved in the crash, the fire, whatever, or whether it's the people that have been evacuated as a result of that incident. Take care of the bill for the cleanup and incident promptly. You can work out the details of liability later. In a case like this, there's almost inevitably going to be lawsuits where that stuff can be decided. But right now, the people that were affected, they didn't ask to be involved. Their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods are at stake, and they need you to step up and be supportive. Public image is half the battle, both in the short term and for the long-term viability of the company. If you're one of those companies that turns your back on the public, your reputation is going to be damaged forever. You want to also do an investigation, be thorough, and include root cause analysis. You're going to need to answer the 6 questions: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Not only to the media, but also internally to your board. You're going to want to be able to prevent recurrence and establish what your liability might be The liability piece is obviously not something you'll communicate to the public, but it's something that you're going to need to know internally to prepare your next steps. And then you'll just have to decide how much of this investigation to release when the time is right. Your board and your investors will need to know what you believe the potential cause is from the beginning, and updates as that investigation continues. The economic impact initially, and then as the incident unfolds and you learn more and the situation develops. What you expect the liability will be, expectation for what you anticipate regulatory enforcement action will be. It could be any of the regulatory bodies. EPA, OSHA, and DOT are the main ones involved when it comes to hazardous materials, but there could be others. FDA, for example. Potential for additional lawsuits. Where are we likely to get additional liability from? Complaints, incidents. How do we as a company recover from this? Not only economically, which is certainly important, but also your name and your reputation. If you did have any liability, how do you recover from that? How do you make sure that you can continue as a company? How could this have been prevented? Were there missed opportunities to prevent this from happening? Were there signs? And then how do we make sure it never happens again? Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Stay safe.